April 15, 2011 began like any other Friday for the thousands of Americans who made their living through a computer screen until they tried to log into their bankrolls and found a red, white, and blue seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The shock was immediate. The world's largest online poker domains, PokerStars, Full Tilt Poker, and Absolute Poker, had been seized by the U.S. Department of Justice. Within hours, a multi-billion-dollar industry that had defined a decade of digital gold rushing was effectively dead on American soil. This was Black Friday, and it didn't just freeze accounts, it dismantled lives, unmasked a massive Ponzi scheme, and forced a generation of players into an exile that would fundamentally rewrite the DNA of professional poker. To understand why the FBI was suddenly at the virtual doorstep, you have to look back at the chaotic Wild West landscape of the mid-2000s, after Chris Moneymaker, an accountant from Tennessee, turned a $40 online satellite into a $2.5 million World Series of Poker victory in 2003, the game exploded. By 2006, however, the U.S. government signaled the end of the honeymoon with the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, or UIGA. While titans like Party Poker immediately fled the U.S. market, others, led by the enigmatic Isai Scheinberg of PokerStars, stayed behind. They relied on legal opinions arguing that poker was a game of skill, not a game of chance, and therefore exempt. For 5 years, they lived in a legal gray area, growing into giants that sponsored television shows like High Stakes Poker and bedecked world champions in their logos. They weren't just gambling sites, they were cultural institutions. But while the players saw a boom, the Department of Justice saw a massive, ongoing criminal enterprise. The 52-page indictment unsealed that Friday morning by Preet Bharara, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, alleged a conspiracy of staggering complexity. Because American banks were barred from processing gambling transactions, the poker sites allegedly resorted to a shell game of epic proportions. They didn't just process payments, they laundered them. The DOJ claimed these companies worked with a network of payment processors who lied to banks, disguising poker deposits as payments for online flower shops, pet supply stores, or jewelry. In one particularly brazen move, the government alleged that payment processors John Campos and Chad Elley effectively purchased a struggling bank in Utah, Sunfirst, by offering a $10 million investment in exchange for the bank agreeing to process poker transactions. They were literally buying the gates to the financial system, moving billions of dollars under the noses of federal regulators. As the domains went dark, a terrifying divide emerged between the two market leaders. At PokerStars, Isai Scheinberg had spent years obsessively ensuring that player funds were segregated from the company's operating cash. When the hammer fell, PokerStars was ready. Within days, they reached a deal with the DOJ to regain their domain name specifically to facilitate the withdrawal of funds. American players on PokerStars, though barred from playing, saw their money returned with clinical efficiency. But over at Full Tilt Poker, the second largest site in the world, the silence was deafening. Thousands of players, including legends like Phil Ivey and Tom Dwan, had millions trapped in the system. As weeks turned into months, the crushing reality set in. The money wasn't there. In September 2011, the DOJ amended its complaint with a bombshell accusation. Full Tilt Poker was not a legitimate company, but a global Ponzi scheme. While the site told its users their money was safe and segregated, the board of directors, including poker celebrities Howard Lederer and Chris Jesus Ferguson, had allegedly been lining their pockets with player deposits. The numbers were harrowing. Full Tilt owed players worldwide approximately $390 million, but the company's bank accounts held only $60 million. For 4 years, while the site operated, the board had distributed over $440 million to itself. They had been paying themselves with the very money players thought was sitting safely in their virtual wallets. The professor and Jesus were no longer just poker icons. They were the faces of a massive betrayal that left the community reeling. The human cost was devastating. Thousands of professional grinders, many in their early 20s with no other work experience, found their entire net worth frozen indefinitely. This created the first wave of poker refugees. To keep their careers alive, young Americans began a mass exodus to countries like Canada and Mexico, where they could still access the global player pools of PokerStars. They weren't moving for the scenery, they were moving because it was the only way to pay the rent. In cities like Vancouver and Playa del Carmen, entire apartment complexes became ad hoc dormitories for American poker pros living in a strange digital exile. They spent 14 hours a day in front of monitors, fueled by delivery food and the desperate need to rebuild what the government had taken in a single morning. This era of exile fundamentally changed how the game was played. Before Black Friday, online poker was soft. You could make a comfortable living just by being better than the whales, the recreational players who gambled for fun. But with the American recreational market gone, the global player pool became a shark tank. The game became more professional, more mathematical, and significantly harder. This was the catalyst for the modern solver era. Without the steady influx of easy money, pros were forced to use advanced software to study game theory optimal, or GTO strategies. The era of feel and reads gave way to a cold, calculated pursuit of mathematical perfection. The players who survived this transition, names like Doug Polk and Ben Solsky, weren't just gamblers. They were elite analysts who treated the game like a high-stakes science. The legal saga dragged on for nearly a decade. Ray Bitar, the CEO of Full Tilt, eventually surrendered and faced a possible 65-year sentence, though he later reached a plea deal due to a life-threatening heart condition. Isaiah Scheinberg remained a fugitive for years, shuttling between the Isle of Man and Israel before finally surrendering in 2020. In a twist that few saw coming, PokerStars eventually agreed to a massive $731 million settlement with the DOJ, which included a deal to acquire the assets of their disgraced rival, Full Tilt. In doing so, PokerStars and Scheinberg stepped in to pay back the hundreds of millions owed to Full Tilt's players. When Scheinberg was finally sentenced in a New York courtroom, the judge noted his extraordinary efforts to make players whole and sentenced him only to time served and a $30,000 fine. To the poker community, he was a complicated hero who had saved the industry from its own worst actors. The legacy of Black Friday is visible in every corner of the game today. Online poker has slowly returned to the U.S., but it is a fragmented, state-by-state landscape, far removed from the global, borderless community of 2010. The golden age of the poker boom ended that morning in April, replaced by a world of rigorous regulation and hyper-competitive strategy. The red FBI seal was more than a warning. It was a border crossing into a new reality. If you know someone who would find this deep dive into the darkest day in poker history fascinating, pass this episode along to them.